Okay, thank you and good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the Society for inviting me here today and also the prestigious award that was given, I think it was in June. And I'm looking forward to sharing some of my work with you today. So I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, who have preserved and continue to preserve our natural environment, including the air that we breathe, which is very important for what I'm going to speak about today. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background to set the stage. So today we're going to be focusing on common respiratory disorders of the elderly, which is what I study. And we're focused on interstitial lung disease and lung cancer. So there are two separate diseases, very different diseases, but they share the similar story. So if you look at the middle circle, you'll see risk factors for both of them. So smoking, environmental pollutants, occupational exposure, asbestos and silica exposure, genetic alterations are also common in both of them, for example, telomere shortening, aging, and males are more at risk. So just to focus on interstitial lung diseases for a while. So interstitial lung diseases are a gamut of more than 200 diseases, and they're characterized by scarring and fibrosis in the lung tissue. The most common one is idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, which I will refer to as IPF from here on, and they make up about 60% of those 200 diseases. So if you look at this illustration over here, the alveoli, which are the terminal air sacs, you'll see a healthy one, which is the one on the left, and you can see that they have thin walls, which facilitates gas exchange. However, if you look at the one on the right, the fibrosed alveoli, you'll see that the walls are very thick, and that prevents gas exchange from happening freely. So what happens, you find people present with a series of symptoms: a prolonged dry cough, shortness of breath, fatigue as a result of the shortness of breath, joint and muscle aches, loss of appetite, and clubbing of the fingers. So there's not much known about interstitial lung diseases in Australia beyond the clinical aspects of how it's treated. Globally, the average survival time is about 2 to 5 years. And since 2017, there were 2 drugs that were approved in Australia and subsidized by the government. But these 2 drugs don't cure the disease. Basically, what they do is slow down progression, and they have lots of side effects. So the group of researchers who I work with, it's a national collaboration called the Center for Research Excellence for Pulmonary Fibrosis, which is researchers from a group of universities around Australia in every state and territory except the Northern Territory. So most of the work that we do is focused on diagnosing people earlier, preventing progression of the disease, and individualized care for patients. And the work that I do really supports this work. It enables the translation into policy and then practice. So skipping from ILDs, going to lung cancer. I'm sure everybody knows what lung cancer is, but just as a definition, lung cancer is a disease where cells from the lungs grow out of control. They form tumors, which spread to nearby tissue and then spread throughout the other parts of the body. So there are 3 typical types: adenocarcinomas, which happen in those air sacs that I showed earlier, and these usually form tumors at the top part of the lung. Then you have squamous cell carcinomas, which are the second most common ones, and they form in the bronchi, which are the tubes that bring air to the lungs. And these usually form tumors in the central part of the lungs. And then you have the rare one, which are large cell carcinomas, which are very, very rare, but very fast growing, and they usually occur in the bottom part of the lungs. Now, what you'll notice is that the symptoms are quite similar to interstitial lung disease, where you have the persistent cough, shortness of breath, fatigue. But lung cancer, you also have things like hemoptysis, which is coughing up of blood. You also have hoarseness, frequent respiratory infections, unexplained weight loss, and chest pain. So just a few facts about lung cancer in Australia and Tasmania. Around 15,000 people are diagnosed every year in Australia with lung cancer, and about 60% of these people actually die, about 9,000 people die. In Tasmania, Tasmania has the second highest rate of new cases of lung cancer in Australia, just behind Northern Territory, but also the highest mortality in men and the second highest in women. Now, Tasmania has one of the highest smoking rates in Australia. Now, that accounts for the fact that we have lots of new cases, but it doesn't explain why we have so many people dying. So just going to some of the research, so I'm first going to speak about what I'm doing under the Center for Research Excellence for Pulmonary Fibrosis. So my work under this Center for Research Excellence for Pulmonary Fibrosis focuses mainly on the health and economic burden of interstitial lung diseases. So when we speak about the health burden, we're speaking more about the epidemiology, so looking more at incidence, prevalence, mortality, and survival, and I'll explain these a little later. And then looking at the economic burden, we're focused more on the cost burden, cost effectiveness of treatment, and prediction models. And then alongside that, we're looking at all of the factors that influence both of these. So for the health burden, incidence is how many new cases happen per year. The prevalence would be how many people are living with the disease. Mortality, how many people have died. And survival, how long people live. When we're looking at the economic burden, we're looking at maximizing the population's health within the constraints of available resources. Resources are finite, so we want to get maximum value. And when we speak of value, we're thinking about quality of life, we're thinking about improvements in the clinical picture, how many deaths we've averted from whatever intervention we're using, and how many life years that person has gained by using that intervention. But there's the cost aspect to it, which is direct costs, which would be costs that the government pays, or out-of-pocket costs, which would be costs that the individual's purse. And then we also have indirect costs, which are linked to productivity. So whatever the disease might cause that individual to be less frequent at work, which will of course influence their income. And then we look at this in the context of cost effectiveness, the cost versus the benefit, and the cost that we're minimizing by using these interventions. So what have we found so far? So we focused mainly on IPF. So we've found that the crude mortality is about 5.9 per 100,000 persons, incidence about 10.4 per 100,000 persons, and crude prevalence about 32,000 persons. Now to translate that into English, this translates to about 2,800 new cases per year, about 1,500 people dying per year, and about 8,700 people living with the disease. And this is only persons between the age of 50 and above. We also found that males have higher estimates than females. And additionally, as you increase in age, the estimates are higher as well. So when we looked at quality of life, so we use tools that are used across disease areas so that the estimates for quality of life are comparable. And that measure is called a utility value, and it ranges from 0 to 1, where 1 is the best quality of life and 0 is the worst quality of life. However, if you look here, you'll see that there's one that says minus 0.57. So some people actually value their quality of life worse than death. So when we looked at our study and compared that to the general population, so the general population indices would be on the right. So they range from 0.83 to 0.87. And that for people living with IPF is ranges 0.65 to 0.69. When we compare that to other developed countries, Germany, Netherlands, and the USA, we noted that for Australia is even lower than that of other countries. for people living with IPF. We also looked at other diseases that are frequent in the older population. So quality of life for people living with IPF was similar to that of somebody living with angina, an uncomplicated stroke or COPD, and heart failure, lung cancer with somebody who's going through chemotherapy, and liver cancer was where we saw worse indices for quality of life when compared to persons living with IPF. In terms of the dollars, we use administrative data, so hospitals, data generated from the hospital, also the pharmaceutical benefit scheme and Medicare. And we noted that the cost per person for a 12-month period was approximately $29,000. And for out-of-pocket costs, an individual would spend about $2,700, giving you a total of about approximately $31,000 per year for somebody living with IPF. When we extrapolate that to the prevalence, which is the number of people that are living with that disease, it's approximately $299 million per year that's spent between individuals and the government. So we wanted to know where all of that money was being spent. So we found that the two medications that are being used for treatment of that disease formed approximately 61% of the cost. And that's because each of those drugs cost about $4,000 per month per individual for treatment. Other things that were big tickets were admissions and medication for comorbidities. We looked at it from a different perspective. So we looked at the annual cost per person for IPF, and then we looked at something called the national per capita health expenditure, which basically is the average amount of money that the government spends on an individual in Australia. So for IPF, that was 4 times the national per capita expenditure, and the only other disease that's frequent in older persons that had a higher ratio was lung cancer, which was 6 times that of the national per capita expenditure. So what do we plan to do next? So we've looked at IPF, but remember I said there are about 200 different subtypes of ILDs. So we're going to expand what we've done for IPF to look at the broader gamut of ILDs, and also develop a patient simulation model that will help us predict lifetime costs, quality of adjusted life years, which are basically the quality of life over the individual's lifetime, and also life expectancy. And then we're going to use this in our evaluations of the interventions that the rest of the team is developing for early diagnosis, earlier treatment, or new treatments that they're discovering. So we'll shift to lung cancer. So approximately 50% of lung cancers are diagnosed at late stages, and there's evidence, stories that tell us that it's because of delayed diagnosis and treatment, but there's no documented evidence. So the project that I'm working on currently, which is funded by the Royal Hobart Hospital Foundation, seeks to understand patient and system challenges that may cause delays in treatment. So what we're taking an approach to sort of like co-design an improved model along with all of the stakeholders involved. And we're basically looking at the key influencing factors and assessing patient experiences, and also looking at the economic impacts of redesigning the system to guide effective interventions. So far, we've looked at survival. We've taken a closer look at survival in Tasmania. So we looked at the 5-year survival for somebody with lung cancer. So on the far left is the 5-year survival for Australia. That's the national 5-year survival. And you can see for Tasmania, it's 17.6 compared to the 26% nationally. We also noted that males had worse survival than females, and that persons who were more than 65 years also had worse survival. As expected, we expected that there would be a higher chance of death if the cancer had spread, but we also noted that persons of lower socioeconomic status had a higher chance of dying. And also, we were quite pleased to see this last one here. Between 2014 and 2021, the chance of dying decreased, and we assume that's because of more modern treatments and better diagnostic interventions. What we also noticed was that where you live actually influenced your outcome. So we use Inner Hobart as a reference, and as you can see, the West Coast, the darker areas are the higher chance of dying with lung cancer. So you can see the north, northeast, and west have much higher chance of dying. And the only place that we found that had a better outcome than Hobart was Sorrel and Dodges Ferry. I'm not sure why. We might have to try to figure that one out. We also did a hospital audit, and the hospital audit basically looked at standards for different benchmarks for diagnosis and treatment. So for example, if somebody is referred by a GP to the hospital, they should see a specialist within 14 days. And they should be diagnosed by 28 days, and by 42 days, they should be on treatment. What we noticed is that people were seeing specialists, so 93% of people met that benchmark. 71% were meeting the benchmark for meeting the diagnosis standard. But when you look at treatment, it was between 1 and 11% of people that were actually meeting the standard for getting timely treatment. And this study was actually really, the doctors at the hospital were really quite enthusiastic to get that information out there. What we also found was that COVID had no effect on the numbers that we saw. It was similar before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. Non-smokers had a shorter wait time by at least 24 days. Patients with more comorbidities had longer waiting times, as much as 13 days. And all the patients had a longer waiting time to treatment, which ranged from about 20 to 76 days. So one of our first activities for the project was to sit with different stakeholders. So we met with all persons from the different specialties around the hospital, with patients, with carers, with Cancer Council, with the Tasmanian Health Service, to sit and kind of discuss some of the challenges that they were experiencing. And with these, we sort of developed data collection tools for focus groups, interviews, and for surveys. So these are some of the challenges. They looked at patient challenges and system challenges. One of the top ones that they mentioned for patients was health literacy and access to GPs. And in terms of the system, it was more about the referral pathways and training. So we have interviewed GPs so far, and they listed 3 sets of challenges. One was diagnosing lung cancer, distinguishing lung cancer symptoms from other chronic respiratory diseases, and also access to diagnostic tests, tools, and aids. We interviewed about 15 GPs from around the state, and some of them said that they don't even have access to chest x-rays for the patients. So that kind of limited their diagnosis. Patient disengagement, low health literacy, cultural barriers. Some patients are in denial, and other patients, because they've had the symptoms for such a long time, they kind of normalize it. And also patients with lots of chronic diseases, other diseases, they sort of prioritize that instead of new symptoms. They also said that the referral pathways are quite fragmented, and there's a lot of outdated communication systems. So they were saying for some referrals, they still have to use a fax machine. Limited specialist access and communication. They have no communication channels between themselves and the hospital. and also lack of holistic patient management. So the specialists are focused on the lung cancer, the GPs are focused on their comorbidities, and there's no communication. So some of the next steps are interviews with carers, patients, and healthcare workers. So we've already done the carers and the patients, so now we're looking at healthcare workers. We're currently doing a cost analysis using health service data, and we're also collecting information from patients more on out-of-pocket costs. We're also doing a quality of life survey, and then with all of these inputs, this and the inputs from these studies, we're going to sit with all stakeholders and sort of co-design an intervention that will improve some of the care pathways. We're then going to pilot that and evaluate. After the evaluation, see some of the things that we can do to improve it, and then do a budget impact. So basically cost the new intervention, how it's going to be incorporated into the the hospital system, and basically give the policymakers information as to, okay, for a 10-year period, it's going to cost this, and these are the benefits that you're going to get from implementing these new interventions. So these are some of the stakeholders that we're working with, and I think that was my last slide. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me clearly?
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
All right. So I'm quite old-fashioned. I still have a set of notes, printed notes, just to make sure I remain within the 15 minutes. So good afternoon. My name is Manon Simon. As mentioned by Julie earlier, I'm a lecturer at the law school down at St. Didier campus. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here, and to thank the Royal Society of Tasmania for this amazing opportunity to present some of my work with you. So I'd also like to thank my supervisors and mentors who couldn't be here today, the dear professors Jan MacDonald, Jeffrey McGee, and Dr. Karen Brandt. So today I'm going to walk you through some of the findings from my doctoral work. So I completed my PhD in 2022, and last year I published some of the findings from my thesis in this book, Learning from Weather Modification Law for the Governance of Regional Solar Radiation Management, where I added a case study of the Canadian legal framework, but I'll keep this one out of this presentation. So today I'm going to focus on some of the lessons that I've learned, I guess, by examining the cloud seeding or weather modification laws in Australia and the United States. And I'll first give you a bit of background about the technologies that I'm talking about before telling you, giving some of my findings with a particular focus on Tasmania. And if time permits, I'll conclude with some broader lessons. Okay, so as some of you may know already, cloud seeding is a weather modification technique that consists of spraying artificial particles into certain types of clouds to enhance or trigger the precipitation process. So it is used around the world in about 50 countries to increase rainfall and snowfall for water, food, or energy security. So in Australia, for instance, it's been used, or it was used, to increase fresh water in order to augment hydroelectricity production. So even though it's a technology that's been around since World War II, there's still a lot of uncertainties around the effectiveness, the ecotoxicity, the potential downwind effects, and impacts on social, ecological, and hydrological systems. So because of these uncertainties, there's been a decline in public funding in research and development of cloud seeding technologies in the 1980s, with CSIRO terminating their research and development program in 1981. But with climate change and the impact of climate change becoming more prevalent, there's been renewed interest in cloud seeding technologies in recent years as a means to counteract some of the impacts of climate change, like water scarcity and impacts on agriculture. So that was for the first set of techniques or technologies. The second set of technologies that I was interested in is solar radiation management, which I will call SRM. You might have heard about it. It's also referred to as solar geoengineering. And I won't spend too much time on this because they're still, I guess they're still at the research stage, so still highly speculative. But already highly controversial because they carry significant social and environmental risks. So SRM is a set of different technologies that are being considered to increase the reflectivity of the planet, to decrease the absorption of solar radiation in the atmosphere, and reduce global temperatures. So apart from planetary scale applications that have received a lot of attention, these technologies are also investigated for application at the regional level. So to protect key ecosystems like the Arctic, so the polar regions, but also reef systems like the Great Barrier Reef. So that last technology, marine cloud brightening, was one of the technologies that I was especially interested in because it resembles greatly these already established cloud seeding technologies. And marine cloud brightening has been investigated on the Great Barrier Reef to decrease sea surface temperature and counteract some of the impacts of warming on the health of corals. The problem with solar radiation management is that traditional or existing legal frameworks do not govern the risks and uncertainties associated with these techniques. So there is a consensus that if we ever to deploy these technologies, we will need robust governance arrangements tailored to these particular risks. So given these observations, I asked then what lessons can we learn from these established cloud seeding governance for the governance of these emerging technologies, regional solar radiation management. And these lessons are really important, not only because they can help to improve current or new governance regimes for cloud seeding projects, but they can also be used to develop new governance frameworks for solar radiation management, including experiments like the one conducted on the Great Barrier Reef under the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. So this picture actually shows one of the world's first marine cloud brightening experiment that was conducted in 2020 by a team of researchers at Southern Cross universities. They've been doing a few more of these experiments since then. I won't go into the detail of this. I guess what's important for our purpose today is that I've identified 4 elements that would be needed to ensure the adaptive governance of these techniques, right? So adaptive governance is the theoretical framework that I use. I'm happy to answer questions about that if you have any. But I selected these 4 elements that I considered necessary for the good governance of these techniques, right? So multi-scale institutions, participatory decision-making, iterative learning, and conflict management. And so I will unpack on these different elements so I'll first introduce you to my case studies, and then I will go through each of these elements by giving you some of the best practices that exist and looking at the Tasmanian experience in comparison. So just very briefly, cloud seeding in Australia, there hasn't been any legislative framework set up at the Commonwealth level. All there is a set of non-binding guidelines, the UNCAN guidelines on cloud seeding, but apart from that, cloud seeding is mostly regulated at the state level. So I looked at New South Wales with the Snowy Mountains program, which ran for about 20 years and was terminated this year, actually. I'll talk a bit more about this. So this program was regulated under the Snowy Mountains Cloud Seeding Act, as I said, just terminated recently, partly because the costs of renewing the infrastructure were, I guess, too high compared to the effectiveness of the project itself. That's one of the reasons why it was terminated. And so it means that as today, there is no cloud seeding projects in Australia, right? Just so we're clear on this. The second state I looked at, obviously, is Tasmania. As some of you would know, Tasmania has been actually a leading state in terms of weather modification, with a cloud seeding program that was run by Hydro Tasmania. Started with research in the 1960s, and that led to an operational program between 1998 and 2016. That program was terminated following a flood allegedly caused by cloud seeding, though experts have demonstrated that the seeding that day did not have any impact on the disaster. I'll just bring to your attention that there was no legislative framework in place in Tasmania. In the United States, there is a piece of legislation at the federal level, the Weather Modification Reporting Act, but otherwise these projects are also regulated at the state level. So I've looked at California and Texas. I won't go into the detail of it, but I'll give you a little bit of some examples as I go through these different elements. All right, so the first element that I looked at is what I call multi-scale institutional arrangements, or a structure where various institutions interact across multiple scales. And the Tasmanian framework, the Texas framework is a great example of multi-scale institutional arrangements, because the state legislation actually enables multi-scale collaboration between institutions at the local, state, and national level. So you have cities and counties getting together in weather modification associations to govern cloud seeding collaboratively. You then have the State Department of Licensing and Regulation that oversees a permit and license system, and then operators will still report at the national level to NOAA. In Tasmania, on the other hand, Hydro Tasmania has conducted cloud seeding activities largely at the discretion of the executive power. They were subject to these non-binding guidelines, but there's been limited consultation with local councils or local organizations, and that partly led to the controversies with the West Coast Council. So what I show is that greater collaboration, especially with local institutions, would have improved the adaptiveness and to some extent the legitimacy and the accountability of this program. The other aspect that I looked at is participatory decision making. So it's a process that would involve experts, stakeholders, as well as the public. And that needs to happen at an early stage of the decision making, but also throughout the decision making. And so again, Texas is a great model of participatory decision making, partly because it is such a recent piece of legislation. So that state legislation created an advisory committee on weather modification that foster collaboration between scientists, regulators, as well as local communities. That piece of legislation also provides for public notice and hearing, and for public information to be available online regularly, to be updated regularly online. It also creates a system of election to disapprove a weather modification permit at the request of the public, so very participatory. in Tasmania, that approach was too reactive. So in 2008, the West Coast Council raised concerns over the cloud seeding project, and that led to community consultation with West Coast local residents. They raised concerns around the fact that these activities were conducted without public notice, participation, or benefit sharing. And so that resulted in some change made to the program, including Hydro Tasmania publishing regularly information on their website, on radio stations, local radio stations, to keep the public informed of what was happening. They actually came up with a community engagement plan in 2016, but that was just before the flood, and that event cut short to this community engagement plan. So that approach would have been great, and that's some of the findings of my work, is that it should have happened much earlier, right? That engagement with the public and with the local stakeholders should have happened at an early stage of the program if we wanted to build that public trust and to some extent acceptability as well. The third element is a bit of a barbaric word that I call iterative learning. It's the idea that we need to have a decision-making process that not only facilitates a programmatic assessment, but also allows for monitoring and review information to be fed back into the decision-making to improve that process over time. New South Wales is a great example of iterative learning or adaptive process. So there was no EIA requirement, but under that piece of legislation, so the Snowy Mountains Cloud Seeding Act, Snowy Hydro had to come up with an environmental management plan, or EMP. And under that EMP, they had to report their meteorological and environmental monitoring data to the New South Wales Environmental Protection Authority that would then review Snowy Hydro's activities, compliance with the Act and the EMP. Right? So that allowed the data to really be fed into the decision making and used to revise it over time. And that's on that basis that Snowy Hydro could phase out their cloud seeding activities this year, as I said, because of cost effectiveness issues. The case of Tasmania is really interesting because when Hydro Tasmania conducted their environmental impact assessment back in 1998, it was not regulated by law, but they followed an international standard, ISO 1401, environmental management system. And so back then it would have been considered best practice when it comes to assessment of environmental impact. The problem is when the program became operational, it was not followed by a long-term assessment of social and environmental impacts. And there was no monitoring obligations. That's actually one of the criticisms raised by local communities, that they had no access to this monitoring information. Right? So no long-term monitoring and review. So what I argue here is that if Tasmania ever wanted to resume their cloud seeding activities, they would need to follow an approach close to what New South Wales had developed that is much more adaptive and allow for adjustment over time in response to change and new knowledge. Last but not least, conflict management. So what I refer to as conflict management are all these legal arrangements that would allow both to prevent conflict from arising and that would also allow the resolution of conflict if damage occurred. The problem with cloud seeding and the uncertainties that surround these techniques is that it makes it virtually impossible to attribute damage and therefore to provide avenues for remedies for people that would be affected by these activities. So, and that's consistent across all the jurisdictions that I've looked at. All these states are really struggling with setting up systems that are effective. Yes. Interestingly, in New South Wales, under the EMP, there was a dispute resolution process that allowed for, or an escalation process that allowed for the resolution of dispute between Snowy Hydro and New South Wales government agencies. But this escalation process was not open to other stakeholders, including local communities. Right? I think the Tasmanian example is actually great. Even though I mentioned that that was a concern from the West Coast local residents, there was no distribution of benefits and burden, no proof of financial responsibility or liability from Hydro Tasmania, or no conflict, no avenues for conflict resolution. That community engagement plan, or the process that led to it, this process of consultation that led to it, I think was great in identifying some of the measures that could be put in place to prevent and eventually resolve conflict. So one of the main concerns of the local communities on the West Coast was that increasing rain in a region that is already particularly wet, right, would have impact on their lifestyle, including impacts on infrastructure, potential loss of incomes, loss of opportunities for outdoor activities, and mental health effects, right? And in these reports, they've actually identified measures that could be put in place to compensate for the increased number of rainy days. So they suggested, for instance, that Hydro Tasmania participate to public community infrastructure, or contribute to these wood heater buyback schemes. Right? So very interesting suggestions, but as I mentioned, that community engagement plan was terminated before we see what would come out of it. Right? So again, if Tasmania wanted to resume their activities, having this early engagement with the stakeholders and the public could actually help in identifying what kind of mitigative measure we need to put in place, and or compensation in case of damage. So just to conclude, these lessons, as I mentioned, can be used to improve current cloud seeding projects or to design new cloud seeding projects. So they've already been taken up by, in some jurisdictions around the world. I work closely with the Japanese Science and Technology Agency that's actually currently working on developing a national cloud seeding project to mitigate the impacts of extreme weather events. But it can also be used to design adaptive governance for regional solar radiation management. So just in conclusion, it's the idea that for a governance framework to be adaptive, we will need these multi-scale institutions, so collaborations to allow for policentric governance and redundancy in case one institution fails to properly oversee these programs. We will need participatory decision-making. So that includes interdisciplinary expertise, but also, as I mentioned, stakeholder and public consultation at an early stage of the program and throughout the program. We'll also need iterative learning, where not only we have these, front-end environmental impact assessment, but that need to be followed with a more programmatic approach and a system of monitoring and review. And finally, we will need innovative conflict management mechanisms, because those that we currently have do not respond to the uncertainties and risks of these technologies, of these emerging technologies. All right, well, thank you very much for this opportunity again, and happy to take questions at the end.
So, hello everyone. I'm Branwell. I'm a poet, and my PhD is a creative PhD. So that means that it includes both my own writing, where I'm writing poetry about Antarctic history, as well as an exegesis, which will be my research into the uses of poetry on Antarctic expeditions. So I thought to give a bit of a taste of my own work, I'd start with one of my poems. If there's time at the end, I'll do a bit more, and then in between, we'll discuss poetry on Antarctic expeditions. So, this poem's written as if from the perspective of a book as it's being read, and it's set on the Terra Nova Antarctic expedition, concerning the expedition leader Robert Falcon Scott reading a cheap paperback. I was picked up in Sydney for a sixpence by Deb's pals, and ever since I have been thumbed, dog-eared, oil-smeared, placed down on my face, dropped, tossed, flipped through briskly when a place is lost, critiqued, derided, cracked up and down my spine, torn but rarely ever left unfinished. I was pleased when at last the owner took me up. It was late. He was rooting around in the dark below Debenham's bunk for a book, and there I was. We went back to his quarters, more private than the rest of the hut, but then again, I don't ask for much. All he needs to do now is lay back in his bunk and read me, and I can give him a window into a world where whomsoever lives or dies, he's not the man to blame. So I've included this slide just for some context about my PhD, and this is what the outline of the poetry collection will look like. And while my research into Antarctic expeditions and poetry will inform all three sections, most relevant to my presentation today is this first one, which you've just heard an extract from. It's going to use poems written from the perspective of books to tell the story of the expedition. And two of the books I'm going to need to write about will be the poetry of Robert Browning and Alfred Tennyson. And today I'm going to be analysing the roles of these central figures in 19th century British poetry played on heroic age expeditions. When the reading or writing of poetry comes up in biographies of explorers or accounts of expeditions, it's often introduced with a tone of surprise. You might be finding it surprising right now that there would be overlap between these two worlds, which seem on the face of it quite different: the risky, arduous business of Antarctic exploration and the intellectual, aesthetic sensibilities of the poets. However, while encountering poetry in these contexts in isolated incidents seems quite surprising, when we look at the broader picture across expeditions and individuals, we find that the reading and writing of poetry in Antarctica was a regular occurrence. This demonstrates the important role that poetry played in late 19th and early 20th century British culture, extending to the very furthest reaches of its empire. What resonances and uses would poetry have in such a remote and challenging environment as Antarctica? I'm going to examine some of them today using the example of Tennyson and Browning, and specifically the rivalry between fans of each poet. On March the 8th, 1902, a debate took place aboard the ship Discovery, the residence of the men of the British National Antarctic Expedition. The debate was headed by Louis Bernacchi, the expedition's physicist, and Ernest Shackleton, its third officer. Both men had a taste of poetry, but disagreed as to who was the better poet, Alfred Tennyson or Robert Browning. The expedition's second in command, Albert Armitage, described the incident as follows. It was decided that Shackleton should read extracts from Browning and Bernacchi from Tennyson, while the rest of us judged between the two, voting after each pair of extracts had been read. They declaimed in their best style, endeavouring to point out the beauty of the passages chosen by them. Obviously, to ally oneself with one poet or another suggests an aesthetic preference, but the cultural role played by Browning and Tennyson had meaning attached to each, which is had a web, and the web of meaning that attached itself to each of them shows that something larger was at stake than individual preference. Browning and Tennyson had unusually long literary careers which ran at approximately the same time, making them seem to the public and to critics as representative, of a whole age. However, while enjoying parallel careers, they were also often placed in opposition to one another, whether to prove one was the superior poet or just to illuminate the differences in their creative outlets. These are some of the qualities ascribed to Tennyson and Browning in literary criticism from the 1870s to the 1910s. Sometimes this is framed as a direct comparison, sort of like Tennyson is this, Browning is that. Sometimes these are just the ideas of the same author in separate essays. Speaking generally, the critical impression is one of Tennyson as something as a reclusive artisan, his verses singularly finely crafted in terms of form. He was also not just an English poet, but a poet of Englishness, of English subjects and English preoccupations. This status became somewhat official when he was appointed Poet Laureate in 1850. Browning, on the other hand, wrote primarily about subjects outside of the British Isles. His work was perceived to be less finely wrought, but therefore potentially more spontaneous and perhaps more natural. Unlike Tennyson, he hadn't been to university and was considered something of an outsider. However, then as now, being an outsider was kind of a cool thing to be, and so the lack of poetical flourishes in his work attracted a reputation for Browning as a manly, active poet. To understand the arguments against each poet, I will now provide some extracts showing what were considered to be the weakest points of their work. For both poets, these weaknesses were some of their strengths, but taken to the extreme. For example, one critic calls out this section of Morte Arthur specifically for the description of the knightly growth that fringed his lips as an excessively decorative way to describe King Arthur's moustache. Tennyson's weakest point as a poet was considered to be this tendency to unnecessarily beautify the mundane. Browning, on the other hand, while praised for the spontaneous seeming quality in his work, this spontaneity was aided by a freer use of form and could lend it an expressive speech-like nature. But this example from his book-length poem Sordello shows where for many readers this stylistic feature was taken so far as to render the meaning incomprehensible. As you see here, the lines are frequently broken up by punctuation. We've got some sentences of only one or two words and phrases split across the lines quite unevenly. This means that there's a big reliance on the reader extrapolating from the text to pass the meaning, and this staccato quality is what led one critic to observe that Browning's work could be like reading telegraph language, the sentences trimmed down to such bare essentials that it was difficult to understand what was meant by them. Considering that most of the critics I looked at, if they expressed a preference at all, it was for Browning, it's interesting that they're all also keen to position him as an underdog. This begins with the earliest text that I looked at and extends to the latest, where he and Tennyson are positioned as being summarizing the imaginative life of their century, but with Tennyson positioned as nostalgic or even elegiac, whereas Browning is considered to be forward-looking and likely to influence the next generation of poets. This growth for popularity in Browning is being remarked on a few years prior to the debate about the two poets on discovery that I mentioned earlier, and the interpretation of Browning as a dominant force in a new wave of poetry comes some years later. Therefore, it seems like the expedition might have taken place at just the perfect moment for this debate to happen, where the two poets are more drawn in competition and with Browning just emerging as the equal of Tennyson. Critical consensus on Tennyson and Browning can also... So there was no widespread debate as to the merits of Tennyson and Browning on any other expedition, possibly because the dominance of Browning was too assured, or possibly due to a lack of interest. However, in what may have been a failed attempt to start such a debate on the Terra Nova expedition of 1910, we can see how far-reaching critical perspectives on Tennyson and Browning informed the way that poets were discussed in the Antarctic. Thomas Griffith Taylor, who was one of the expedition's geologists, recorded in his diary that at lunch we had a great discussion on Tennyson and Browning and Tennyson. My simile comparing them to a rough, rare mineral and polished rubbish was not accepted. His metaphor is striking. One of the duties of the expedition's geologists was the preparation of rock sections by grinding them until they were smooth and thin. And this picture shows another of Terra Nova's geologists doing just that. Therefore, in comparing the work of Browning and Tennyson to a rough and smooth mineral, Taylor frames the difference between the two poets as one enmeshed in the material work of the expedition. However, not only is this analysis similar in sentiment of rough and smoothness to the contemporary criticism, it's also similar in the specific choice of metaphor. Tennyson's re-editing of old work was derided by one critic as perpetual polishing, while another suggests that his work was too much like a delicate mosaic of costly stone. Although in Taylor's own metaphor, the link between geological work and poetry is much more overt, this nonetheless demonstrates the extent to which these discussions about Browning and Tennyson, even if they took place in one of the most isolated places on earth, was still informed by the dominant cultural narratives about what good poetry looked like and what it might be compared to. Critical consensus on Browning and Tennyson can also be seen to influence their discussion on the Discovery Expedition. In his account of the expedition, Branwell recalls being relieved by Shackleton after a night watch as follows. Shackleton was a poet, and that morning, poetically very wide awake, and in his wheedling Irish manner, he kept me from my waiting bunk reciting endless verses in the voice and manner of an old-time tragedian. One moment, old son, he wheedled as I edged towards the gangway. Have you heard this? And he would quote Browning as his favourite poet. Obscure lines that neither Browning nor Shackleton understood, much less a cold and yawning physicist. This idea that neither Browning nor Shackleton understood the lines reflects the critical commentary on Browning's incomprehensibility, but this time it's reflecting the views of the expedition's members to criticize Browning rather than to praise him. While I can imagine that Branwell wasn't exactly thrilled to be confronted by Browning first thing in the morning, the anecdote is overall more amusing than condemnatory. As the equally uncomprehending cold yawning physicist, Branwell is himself a part of the punchline. Poetry could also serve more serious purposes on polar expeditions. In an account of the Terra Nova expedition, Apsley Cherry Garrard notes the usefulness of taking a volume of poetry on sledging trips as giving the men something to think about during the long, arduous hours of man-hauling, which is pulling a sledge themselves, which you can see pictured on the screen. Poetry could also be used for the sincere purpose of memorialization. Members of Scott's expedition erected a cross to memorialize him and his party, which had a line from Tennyson's Ulysses on it, and Shackleton's tombstone on South Georgia has a line from Browning. However, despite these more solemn applications, there are a great number of examples of poetry used in a way that is comic regardless of its subject matter. To return to the Terra Nova expedition and Taylor's account of events. Browning's poem, The Bishop Orders His Tomb at St. Praxed's Church, forms the basis of an in-joke for Taylor concerning the difficulties of getting dressed in frozen gear. He writes in his diary, "Each morning we had a painful ceremony when it was necessary to don our frozen boots. Remarks more fervid than polite flew about the tent, and some of us found that quotations from the poet-philosopher lubricated the process. Gritstone or crumble, clammy squares that sweat as if the corpse they keep were oozing through, was supposed to be a very potent incantation." The lines quoted are from the end of the poem, where the bishop realizes that his grand plans for his tomb may all be for nothing, and that he'll be stuck in an unsatisfactory gritstone edifice. Browning conveys the bishop's anger through sibilance and repetition of a harsh C sound, creating the impression that he is hissing and spluttering with rage. For the men of the Western Geological Party struggling to force their feet into frozen boots, these sounds have the useful quality of being able to be spoken with the same vehemence as swearing, but without actually cursing. The quite visceral image of the putrefying corpse seeping into the rock might also have had its appeal for men trying to fit blistered feet into frozen boots. Taylor dubs this process browning the boots as opposed to blacking them, using the work of a poet he admires to make light of the hardships of sledging. So, to return to the original Tennyson and Browning debate, the way the competition was conducted also suggests that entertainment was the priority. We know that Branwell and Shackleton would take turns to read extracts on topics such as love, science, philosophy, wit, art and beauty, after which the other officers present would vote for which extract they preferred. The requirement of a vote after each pair of extracts suggests a somewhat chaotic atmosphere, which seems to be confirmed by the fact that no one can agree on who actually won. Bernanke and Wilson claim a Tennyson victory, whereas Shackleton, Armitage and Browning won, but albeit the margin was slim, only one vote either way. This suggests that the counting may not have been carried out especially carefully, and that a raucous atmosphere would have made this even more difficult. Taylor's use of Browning to ease the painful process of donning frozen boots, the self-parody of discoveries debaters, and the pastiches and parodies of poets across many expeditions and newspapers all hinge on an awareness of the poet's work, and as such are their own kind of intellectual performance. It would be a mark of good taste to not only know a poet, but to know them well enough to imitate them or use their work for humorous ends. There was an alternative to this for the upper and middle class officers, which can be observed in the conclusion to Armitage's account of the Tennyson-Browning debate, in which Farrar, the expedition geologist, caused much amusement after an extract from The Pied Piper of Hamelin had been read by saying, "Well, I'm not much on poetry, but I go on rats." The exact meaning of "go on" this context is slightly unclear to me, but from context it seems to mean something like, "I can understand / appreciate rats." But the contrast is clear between the high-minded idea of poetic debate and the participant who lacks the cultural savvy to judge the extracts and anything more profound than rodents. Whether entirely seriously or not, applications of Tennyson and Browning's poetry on heroic age expeditions mirrored critical opinion as to their strengths and weaknesses, and so also invoked a range of other signifiers which were attached to their work. However, while both of the most devoted aficionados to one poet that I've discussed, being Shackleton on Discovery and Taylor on Terra Nova, have both been Browning fans, in reality most readers would not have limited themselves to one writer or the other. While Shackleton's liking for Browning was so well known as to be mentioned in his obituary, nonetheless his biographer noted that he kept his early liking for Tennyson. And while Tennyson is not so well represented as Browning in an expedition context, his elegant lines and status as poet laureate were often used to convey dignity on deceased polar explorers in need of memorialization. Tennyson had written the epitaph for the Arctic explorer John Franklin, and in newspaper coverage of Scott's death, the Times printed the same poet with one amendment, the substitution of south for north. A decade later, the same poem with the same alteration would be used in the official account of the Shackleton-Rowan expedition to memorialize Scott's sometime colleague and rival, Ernest Shackleton. The poetry of Tennyson still had its purpose in Edwardian society, and just as the binary of Browning versus Tennyson is complicated by actual reading activity on polar expeditions, so too could poetic taste cross boundaries between different types of people, readers, and circumstances. I think I may not have enough time to read any more of my own poetry, but I would thank you for listening, and hopefully that provided a little case study into the ways that poetry was used in Antarctic expeditions of the past. So, thank you. So I also have some stuff about Sidney Jeffries, who was the wireless operator on the Mawson expedition. He suffered a psychotic break, and so I'll read a little bit. I can read a little bit of that, if that's okay. 1st March 1913. There are 2 snorers tonight. Oh no, hold on. Strong signals from Macquarie, but no matter how many times you call, they don't respond. Jammed again, or else some fault with the transmitter. That's appropriate interview.
Transmitter, go on.
Yeah. The signals fade until inaudible. You've heard messages through heavier static, and there's not the faintest glimmer of an aurora. Perhaps Sawyer has closed. There is another pattern in the background. It's neither Telefunken nor Marconi. It does not even have the rhythm of Morse. Yet there's a regularity to the pips more than mere chance. You close your eyes as if you might put the sense of them together in the darkness, words reforming from chalk dust onto the blackboard. There are two snorers tonight, one low and sonorous, one squealing with each intake of breath. They never quite synchronize, but overlap in infinite variation, and to add to these barnyard sounds, every now and then, the howl of a dog from the veranda. It's still there, the pattern in the rush of static, a faint but insistent throbbing against the blare and crackle of the atmosphere. There was a time before morsing was second nature, and that too a jumbled mess. Is this like that?
No one's going to ask a question? Yeah.
I have one question. Is this cheating?
Yeah, good enough.
It's about for you, Manon. In terms of governance, I think of maritime, international policy on things that aren't, they don't have very definite boundaries. How do you find that with thinking about Antarctica too, when it's a resource that everyone needs? But anyway, can you just say a little bit more about what governance looks like from a legal standpoint?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You mean it is considered a commons?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, or should I?
I'm blocking you, that's all.
Oh no, it's all good. Yeah. Have to speak in the mic. Yeah, that is a. It's working. Yeah. It is a great question. So the question of governing the commons, and so the weather or atmospheric resources being considered commons, and as you said, travel beyond man-made boundaries. So there are a few principles of international law that have been applied to these, particularly weather modification, because it's been around for so long. And obviously the planetary scales intervention definitely raised these questions, this wider question of governing the commons. That's partly the reason why I focused on these regional scale applications and smaller scale applications, because they don't have quite the same implications as when you're trying to deploy or at least develop these technologies at the global scale, right? It is very much work in progress, to be honest. So I just recently published a paper with the Japanese team on commoning the weather, so on this concept of weather commons and whether we need no pun intended. If we need to have something that is more appropriate to govern these intangible resources, I guess. Yeah. So that definitely work in progress.
I have one for Ingrid, and that is, why is Tasmania so poor in the, and all the measures, other than they smoke too much or we smoke too much?
In terms of Tasmania is quite curious compared to the rest of Australia. First of all, health literacy levels. Second of all, the aging population. So Tasmania has an older age population compared to the rest of the states, and that links to lots of other complex disease conditions. Whilst we have the best air quality, so you would think that we shouldn't really have problems with respiratory diseases. There are other aspects that are kind of bad in terms of the indoor air heating with wood fire and those sorts of things. That adds to the smoking context. So whilst we have good air quality, indoor air quality, and other aspects, including health literacy and other aspects of risk factors, such as from young children in terms of the way we eat and that sort of stuff, exercise, and all of those risk factors that contribute to not only respiratory diseases, but other diseases, chronic illnesses like diabetes, heart disease, etc. So a lot of the work we do at Menzies now tackles childhood illnesses or chronic diseases, so that we don't have such a high burden of chronic diseases in the older age groups.
So much for fresh air there.
Ingrid.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Thanks, Ingrid, for your talk. I'm just wondering, did you look at the effectiveness of government programs which intend to stop or help people quit smoking or not start smoking, in Tasmania particularly?
Yeah, so we didn't take that into the context of our both of the illnesses. because that's sort of like the prevention aspects, which other people are currently working on. But that is a good question because there are a lot of programs around smoking, but it does seem to be something that is sort of like phasing out because smoking was really popular in the 40s, 50s, 60s. So we saw some improvement in that, but now with vaping coming on, which is also creating a similar problem, we're expecting to see some worsening with the younger population as well. So cessation programs will not only have to look at traditional smoking, but some of the new era smoking like the vaping, etc. Yeah.
One more? Yeah.
It's okay, I can speak. Just got a question for you about the poetry. What's the role of poetry in modern day exploration in Antarctica?
So, I mean, technically it's a little bit outside of the scope of the PhD, but it is something that I'm interested in, and so I have kind of been, when I've had the opportunity to speak to people who've been down to bases and so on, like more recently, it's something that I have kind of been curious about. It does seem that poetry is still something that people feel the urge to start writing at a certain point once you're overwintering in Antarctica, which I think makes sense because obviously there's like one aspect of it is there's only a limited number of things you can do, but also I think that it can be really useful as a way for people to process strong emotions. And so if you're in a context where you don't have as much privacy as perhaps you're used to, like it can be a useful way to kind of express those feelings. And yeah, I suppose the people I've spoken to it more about have been people who are maybe in Antarctica in say like the 70s, so not quite contemporary, but I wouldn't be surprised if it still had a role to play today.
I think I'll just say thank you very much on behalf of us all for 3 fascinating and totally different and marvellous talks. So thank you very much.